Mention a couple things. I'm really excited about this race. I just think people said, why do you want to be governor in a difficult fiscal time? And I think this actually gives us an opportunities to do some changes in state government that can really be productive. And I believe still optimistic about our economy if we do things that continue our innovative path that we've had for so many decades in the state of Washington. So I'm fundamentally running for governor so that I can help build a working Washington. We've got 300,000 people out of work, and I have focused my candidacy in every measure on ways to create jobs. And that's the fundamental goal of the next governor, because creation of jobs is probably the most important thing we can do to generate revenues for education. It is the most important thing we can do to help economic revival, and that's what I've focused on. So I've gone out and listened to businesses across the state and developed an economic plan for growing these jobs around this basic belief that what we do so well here is we innovate. We create innovative new industries and new technological revolutions. And I believe we are on the cusp of several, and we ought to focus on our ability to grow those businesses. And what I've done is, in the development of my economic plan, I made a very conscious decision, and that decision was to reject the ideological approach of either the left or the right. And I've decided to go out and look for the things that can actually help real businesses in real time create real jobs. And you'll see more than 75 proposals in my plan to do that. I'll just give you a flavor of the things I want to do, just maybe list 2 or 3 of them. So we have really good research and development in our state, the University of Washington, Washington State. They do gangbuster research and development, but we do not commercialize that R&D at nearly the rate that I believe we can and should. The University of Utah, per $100 of investment, gets about 5 times as many companies out of that by commercializing that R&D. I want to free some of the colleges from some of the archaic restrictions so that we can allow them to enter into equity partnerships at a faster rate with small businesses to grow new small businesses in this state. If we do this at half the rate that the University of Utah does, if we succeed accelerating at that rate, that would create $3 billion of economic activity in the state in the next decade or so. This is a real world thing we need to do to get government to be more of an incubator of real commercialized small business.
Explain just a little bit deeper what it does. If I understand right, that means if someone develops a business idea in the university setting, then they take it and they keep more of the copyrights or more of the...
So the university will be freed from some of the now restrictions to allow the university to enter in an equity partnership.
So they can actually become investors.
They can become investors, and what their investment is not cash, it's intellectual property. Mm-hmm. And it's a good deal for the state because this generates revenues, assuming that the business succeeds. So that's the kind of idea that I want to propose to make our government more of a wellspring for economic activity. I'll give you another one that's important in Kitsap County. We are, obviously very, a lot of military activity in the state of Washington. We're I think about 12th in the United States in military activity. But we're like 26th per capita in the number of contracts and businesses we generate through military involvement. We lose a lot of money here of military contracting that does not come to Washington businesses. And one of the reasons is that when you do military procurement, it's a labyrinth, right, through the halls of the Pentagon. And I want to increase the ability of the state to help small businesses compete. So I want to have a more vigorous procurement technical assistance program. We have such a thing, but it's really not of the scale we need to really help small businesses capture those kinds of contracts. Third idea, we have some really good opportunities in the new horizons of the new high-tech economy and biotechnology and clean energy. But a lot of the small businesses have trouble getting capital early, in their very early stages. So one of the things I'm proposing is to help them generate some capital, not from the state in a sense, but by giving them a research and development tax credit that they can transfer to revenue companies. This is kind of complicated, but basically if you're a company right now, you don't have any revenues. If you're a biotech company, typically you don't have revenues for years, if not over a decade. But you need capital. So what I would propose to do is give them a tradable R&D tax credit that they could then sell to companies with B&O tax liability and generate some capital. Small thing, but very targeted to some of these high-tech startups. So that's just a flavor of some of the things I've proposed. And I think I'm pretty well equipped by experience to help the whole state grow. I want to mention this. It's rare to have a governor who understands the need for ferry service very personally and intimately, and the need to come up with a stable source of funding for our ferries, and have a person with personal and professional experience solving the water woes in the Yakima Valley, which I did when I was a congressman over there. And I think this experience of having been outside of the shadow of the Space Needle, both west and east, is important in a governor. In my first term in Congress, I got the Yakima River Enhancement Bill through, which was very important to improving our ability to increase apple sales and wine development. By the way, I think we might be able to double our wine acreage, some people are telling me, in the next 10 years, if we solve our water problems. So I got the first, or the second phase of the Yakima River Bill through in 1994. Now we're ready for the third phase, and I'm perfectly suited for that job to be a governor to try to develop a consensus on how to do that. But I also have, a life on the west side of the Sound, understand the importance of the ferry system, understand intrinsically how it is jeopardized with no essential, meaningful operating budget, and know we have to solve this problem so that when we move forward with our transportation package in next biennium, ferries are, a very significant part of that. So I think that's an interesting experience that's unique that I want to bring to the governor's office. So I better stop right there.
Let us ask some questions.
Yeah.
That's the first question, actually. Obviously, we always go straight to the ferries.
Right.
There was the recent change in one of the budget proposals, but this one that's on the table still doesn't make people over here real happy. So
you mean a proposal for lock
to
of
cut runs
Mariners run?
Yeah, you cut the late runs off the Bremerton
Right.
route, especially.
Right.
So tell us maybe a little more detail on how we're going to fund ferries into the future, what the ferry system could look like, maybe on a broader level, whether that's passenger-only ferries, changing runs up, how dependent should it be on fares compared to other funding?
Well, let me start where I start in the discussion, and that is that the ferries are an integral part of the state transportation system. There is no reason to see it as a subordinate or, vessel of a lesser god. Bridges and ferries are of equal importance in our transportation system, and there is no reason to see them as some kind of a differentiated part of the transportation system. Now, I believe that when I was in Yakima even, okay? And I've got kind of a unique perspective of being able to go to legislators around the state, including the east side, and describe why the ferry system is important to the entire state, not just to Bainbridge Island and Bremerton. And the reason is because if we're going to move goods and services around this state, we've got to have them. This is integral to economic development. It's not just personal whether you can get home from the Mariners game, although that's a big deal to me, right, and to people in Bremerton. And that proposal ought to be a wake-up call of how we've got to be committed to a funding package. So the first thing I would say is, in the next biennium, we need a transportation package that will in fact allow us to do some of the mega needs we need in our transportation package. The Columbia River crossing in Vancouver, finishing the 520 bridge, doing 167 in Pierce County, which is so important to freight mobility, looking at the north-south freeway in Spokane, and a package for the ferry system to make it in fact a functioning, stable system. And it's got to be a very integral part of that package as we move forward. Now, I don't have any existential view of exactly the percentage allocation between fares and public contribution. But I will say this, it's going the wrong way. It's going the wrong way. The more we are at this point now of having increasing percentage by the fare, you lose the basic integral part of the fact that it's part of the transportation package as a whole. And I don't think that the fares going up is a result of some sort of equity. It's just been an emergency stopgap measure because the state hasn't had a system of financing the ferry system, bottom line. So I think we've got to start going the other direction.
Let's talk about
now,
the financing.
You mentioned passenger ferries and the like,
yeah.
too. Let me just address this. So I think we ought to be open to ideas in that regard. I think there are some possibilities in passenger ferry service, but it needs to be driven by efficiency and utility, not by desperation. And I think that's the important point that we ought to make. Now, the other issue about the ferries is it's hard for people to understand sometimes, but I think I do from an operational standpoint, is that you have a crew and it's hard to just tie them up to a dock for 3 or 4 hours and replace them with a passenger ferry. Sometimes it would seem there might be economies that you really can't get because you've got to have the crew on standby, if you will. So what I'll say is, yes, there are some possibilities here, but I don't think you can look at it as a panacea.
What about you just kind of casually referred to the funding and how we're going to pay for this package. Would you be comfortable going to the voters with a tax package? Is there a legislative way to do it? Is there other kind of reform that you'd look for? How are we going to pay for it?
So my view is that the best way going into this discussion is to take nothing off the table. It's going to be a very challenging thing for our state to reach consensus on this, and I think the responsible thing to do is to not take anything off the table going into this. And we have to do some creative things, and all the state's going to be engaged in it, and going to have to be engaged in it. But one way or another, our economic prospects are dependent on having a package, and I think the next biennium is a timely time to do it. I think we're now at a point where we can make some real decisions about the Columbia River crossing in Vancouver. I think we're at the point where we recognize that the ferry system is on the cusp of going over the cliff. So I think the time is this biennium to really look at a major step for the state.
Well, you say all options are on the table, and that's very nice, but if you were elected governor, what would be your funding priorities? In other words, mechanism priorities. What would you like to propose if you were elected at this point?
Well, what I'd like to propose are the things I talked about, that in fact we move forward with these fundamental infrastructure needs of the state that are all important from a statewide perspective.
Oh, I meant funding. Pardon me. I meant funding. Would you, at this point, would you go to the legislature and ask them to prioritize and come up with the funding, or would you propose a voter initiative to fund the transportation package?
It depends on the progress we can make and our ability to have consensus. And that's going to depend on how far we can move this through the legislative package. And if a vote is necessary, we will go the vote to have a vote of the public. But one way or another, we got to get this job done. And I'll find the most tenable route to get that done.
There's something in your jobs package, or jobs proposal, about a new office that would do what, at least this is how I read it, similar things that the governor does right now when she goes on these kind of trade missions or goes and talks to China and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And you're proposing kind of a more comprehensive group that would do that, if I'm reading
well,
this
what
right.
We're proposing is to break up a dysfunctional agency that is not fulfilling what we need and put it into an office closer to the governor, where the governor can be more hands-on and attentive to the needs of business in our state. Right now we have a Department of Commerce that only has about 12% of the actions actually related to commerce. That doesn't work. That doesn't cut it when you're in a competition with China and Germany and Texas for jobs. So I want to move that real commerce function into a cabinet position closer to the governor's office. It's not building new buildings, it's not any significant hiring, but it's emphasizing the commerce perspective of what we need to do, which is to market the state of Washington, help businesses make sure that the state government is responsive to their needs. The aerospace industry wants one person to go to in the state government, in the governor's office, to make sure that we get the permitting process in a timely fashion, to make sure that we've got response to healthcare needs that their employees may have. The biotech industry wants the same thing. So I think this makes sense because we're in a competition with other states, and frankly we're not competing as aggressively as we should. So it's not a big expansion of government, it's a targeting system to make sure it does its job. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, I talked to a biotech company about a year ago. They were looking at a manufacturing plant in our state, and also looking some other places. You know, they didn't get a call from the governor's office. They got a call from the governor of Georgia. They went to Georgia. we have got to have a more focused approach to compete in this regard. And the states that have succeeded, what they have followed is a strategy of cluster development. They've identified the clusters of industries where if you get to a critical mass of skilled people and infrastructure and a willingness of governor to be committed to it, they've done well. You look at some clusters that have done well in the Research Triangle in North Carolina, some of the development in Texas. We need to up our game on that competitive structure.
How do you, actually, that was one of the questions I had, because you've been real clear on some of this stuff, alternative energy, and some of the big ones that are clearly important to you, and you're talking about biotech a lot and things like that. You've been criticized at times. People say it's called choosing what's going to succeed. And there's some people who don't like that idea. They think we should just make it open for everybody. How do you balance those two things, saying these are the things that the state should be helping without that kind of picking who's going to be a winner phrase?
Well, I don't think we're the only winner we're picking is Washington State, right? And what we have to realize is we're in a competition right now. You can't shut your mind or sort of ignore the fact that other states and countries are competing to create the infrastructure for these growth industries. And we need to fix, to look at what our assets are to be able to do that. We have basically 6. Aerospace, software, biotech, clean energy, agriculture, and military contracting. And so I've gone out and developed a platform to help each one of those. And I can't see why people would be against us saying we should be a winner in military procurement policy. We should be a winner on that. We should be a winner in the development of aerospace. Now that's not me picking the winners, it's the market for understanding we're going to have to increase the sales of airplanes in the world. I got a briefing from Boeing the other day about this by about, I don't know, 30 or 40%. It's a huge number of demand for airplanes. I didn't pick that, the market did. If people can't see the opportunities for clean energy, it would be very surprising to me, because we know the world's going to be a path to the door of somebody to develop substitutes for coal and oil and gas and efficiency. We know that's going to happen. And the reason we know that's going to happen is we cannot continue on this route of putting carbon pollution in the Hood Canal and expect to have salmon in our system. We've already had oyster growers move out of Kitsap County, or Mason County, to Hawaii because the water is becoming so acidic. Now we know the world's going to look for technologies to replace that. Now that isn't me making that decision, that's the science making that decision. And so here's how I look at it. There's no question whether these jobs are going to be created. The only question is whether they're going to be created in China, or Germany, or Texas, or the state of Washington. That's the question. I want our state to be a winner in this regard. Now the good news is, we got some really great things going on in the state of Washington. Western Hemisphere's largest energy efficiency company is in Seattle and Spokane, and also McDonnell Miller. The most durable solar panel in the world today is made in Marysville, Washington. The largest manufacturer of silicone substrate in the Western Hemisphere is in Moses Lake, Washington. The first manufacturer of a lithium-ion battery hybrid tug might be the Martineck Shipping Company in Tacoma. These seeds are out there, but we have to make sure that they've got policies to help them grow.
But it changes it.
By the way, these are, just to make it clear too, because I've been, as you say, criticized about this. We don't have a loan guarantee program in this proposal, okay? So everybody talks about the Cylinder Company. We do not propose a similar.
That's not the role that
we have not proposed a loan guarantee program of that nature. And that's, like I said, I've kind of rejected the idea of the left that you just go out and spend a lot of government money. That's not in my proposal. What is in my proposal are ways to help private entrepreneurs grow their businesses. That makes sense to me.
Is that the new Office of Economic Competitiveness and Development? Is that the linchpin in this whole?
No, I wouldn't call it a linchpin. I think it's just one of the tools in the box. And there's no silver bullet in my economic plan. There's like silver buckshot, if you will, which is meaning we've got plans that add up. I'll give you an example. This issue about allowing commercialization of research. It's going to help move R&D to the lab. Our procurement technical assistance. Not going to help every company in Kitsap County, but there are quite a number that I think will. So we have multiple, what you might call smaller ideas, rather than one cataclysmic change of state government. That's how I've gone about approaching it.
I was just trying to figure out the mechanism. That's why I asked that question. You know, targeting these 7 sectors, how are you going to, what is the mechanism for doing that? You say that the office is just one of those.
So I'll give you an example. So let's talk about the commercialization proposal I've made to help universities move technology out of the lab and into the small business space. That is open to all technologies, not any particular technology. So if you're a geneticist and you have a new system of marking the antibody receptor, you know, on a cell, you could have the same benefit whether you're going to use that for biotechnology, for biomedicine, or whether you're going to use it for forensic scientists. My daughter-in-law is a forensic scientist at the State Crime Lab, so I think about things like that. Or whether you want to use it for the development of a program for the Navy to detect, you know, chemical or biological hazards, or whether you want to use it to improve technology for producing clean water. All of those are available. I guess what I'm saying is that these techniques can be used for multiple industries and multiple technologies. And that makes sense to me.
Let's shift over to education, because that was, you know, you tied it in with your jobs plan and then wrote another paper on education specifically. Mm-hmm. There's one question that we have asked all the candidates that come in here, because it's kind of accepted that early childhood is very important. It's a great bang for your buck, all that mm-hmm. stuff. But what we've been asking is, how do you define the early education programs that are outside of what the Constitution's scope is for K through 12 education? To you, what does that mean, early education? Where should the efforts be, you know, ranging from preschool to Head Start to going into the home? What does it look like to you, and what's reasonable for the state to afford in the coming years?
Well, I think our goal ought to be to go where the science of education leads us. We should be science and neuroscience driven. The neuroscience of the 1940s suggested that if you start talking to children at age, you know, 6, that things will work out just fine. And that was the science of the 1940s and 50s. The science today is that the mind is extremely plastic at age 2, 3, and 4, and that's where you can make unbelievable gains. So my view is that we ought to have an educational system that responds to the new neuroscience, which shows that the most fantastic improvements you could have are age 2, 3, and 4. And we ought to have an ambition and a goal to make sure that we utilize the full nature of that science. And the interesting thing is, you know, the world's leading evaluator is the University of Washington in this regard. We are the center of neuroscience in the world today. And I am very committed to this, and I want to mention this to you. The sort of chic thing to do in education today is to talk about early childhood education, right? It's like everybody embraces it. Well, I was there before it was cool. I supported this idea back in the late 1980s and was active trying to promote early childhood education funding in the late 1980s when I was a legislator from Yakima. The reason I mention this is that this is not a passing fancy with me, and it's a long-time commitment. That's how I got into public life, which is passing a school bond over in Yakima on the 8th try when it had failed 7 times, and then went to the legislature and tried to get early childhood education funded. Not very successfully, actually. So I'm very committed to this. And you know, over time, I want this to become part of our fundamental commitment to the kids of the state. Now, I'm not sure that I'm going to, in the first 2 days, redefine basic education, and because we aren't going to have, you know, $6 billion the first week of my administration. But it ought to be our goal to embed early childhood education in the basic obligations of the state of Washington, because it's the most successful place to put taxpayer money. Now, there's a lot of other things we have to do too. We have to start, in my book, starting to think of basic education, which includes people having a vision for their post-K through 12 career path. We don't have that today. We have a career path for about 50% of our kids who decide to go to a college route. But we've got about, and it's one of the reasons I think we've got a high dropout rate, over 20% of our kids are dropping out. I think part of that is because we don't have a vision statement for them or a path for them to a career post-K through 12. And I think we need that for all of our students. You know, we got, for kids who want to go to 4-year college, we're doing pretty well. For the states that have 45% of their students take the SAT, we actually are the #1 in the United States. It's a little hidden jewel of the state of Washington. We're actually doing very well for this cohort of students. But for the other half, we don't have them have a vision statement for their post-K through 12 career. That's something I want to change. In places that have increased their graduation rates, that's what they've done. Bridgeport, went from 50% dropout to 100% graduation rate in 2011. It's because they gave their students a post-K through 12 vision statement for their careers, and that's what works, keeping students in school. So.
Okay. When you talk about funding, one of the things that you and Rob McKenna, at the debate, kind of got into talking about that, the levy swap, as far as property tax money. Is that an idea? Do you support it in any form? Kind of looking at that kind of a structural change.
Well, what I disagree with my opponent on, who of course has attacked me repeatedly, saying I'm going to tax everything and everybody. He's spending millions of dollars saying that. I think there's a certain irony that in his proposal, he actually proposes a property tax increase on nearly half of the state of Washington, while not generating one net dollar for schools.
Through the levy swap.
That's correct. So in his proposal, he is not generating one net extra dollar for a school in the state of Washington, while still increasing taxes for 47% of the homeowners. And I want to note small business people, because small business people have the obligation of property tax.
If you disagree with that plan, what is the way to kind of shift some of that burden off of the local levy system?
So my plan is, there's a ratio here, a numerator and a denominator, right? There's a fraction, there's a ratio here between the state support and local support. My vision is to increase the numerator, which is state support for schools. That will do two things. It will increase the funds that are available for local schools, and it will decrease the percentage of the total burden borne by local taxpayers. It will do both things. I don't think the best solution is just to reduce the denominator, if you will. That doesn't help schools.
How do you do the top part of it?
Okay, so there are 4 things we need to do. The largest and most dramatic is what I would learn at the UW. I'm not an economist, but I do have a degree in economics from the UW. I majored in economics. And I think it's pretty important to diagnose why the revenues have fallen off the cliff for education and what we have to do to reverse that. The first most fundamental thing we have to do is to get 300,000 people back to work. The reason education funding is at a the principal reason it is in the hole right now is pretty obvious. Wall Street cratered the United States economy, and I voted against the deregulation of Wall Street. I may note there were only 57 of us who did. Cratered the economy. We got 300,000 people out of work as a result. They are not buying and selling goods. Sales tax revenues declined as a percentage of what we expected, and we don't have the revenues for schools. So to me, the most important thing when you've diagnosed a problem is to focus like a laser beam on a job creation program to get people back to work that will increase sales tax revenues, that will allow us to fulfill our paramount duty of the state. That's got to be the fundamental focus of the government, and that is why I have tailored my economic program to job creation. That's the most important thing. There are 3 ancillary things that are important as well, so that we can take money and get it into education. Number 1, we've got to embrace lean management systems of constant quality improvement throughout state government. We are not doing in state government anywhere close to what private enterprise is doing in wringing out production out of a given input. Boeing has increased or will increase their 737 production per square foot of space at their Renton facility by 33%. And the way they've done that is embracing lean management systems of total quality improvement, which empowers line personnel to help change your process. Virginia Mason Hospital adopted this several years ago. They've become the #1 hospital in America, embracing lean management principles. We do not do that in state government today, and there's no reason not to do that. And as governor, I'm going to do that. We're going to embed this lean management system throughout the culture of state government. And
what's your experience with that management style?
Well, we've done parts of that in my congressional office. I can't say that we've fully embedded this in the entire thing. But I've done extensive work with leaders who have been successful with this. Gary Kaplan, who's the leader of Virginia Mason Hospital. If you talk to corporate leaders in Puget Sound, they will tell you that he's one of the great leaders in this regard. The Boeing personnel have done so well. Last week I was at Legacy Salmon Creek Hospital talking to Mr. Avery, who has led this at this hospital. I went to the ICU and saw how they've decreased their overtime rates by about 30% by using these systems. I've talked to King County, which is having success with this. They've reduced their overtime for their sheriff's department about $400,000 using these systems. So I'm ready, willing, and able to lead this. But to do this, this type of change does not come casually. You can't just, sign a memo and say this is done. This is something the top CEO of the agency has to be totally committed to this on a daily basis, and I am and I will be, because it's the only way it's going to happen. Third, we have to recognize where the money has gone that we do have, and what we've done is we've hollowed out our educational budgets and we've increased our health care expenditures for the state of Washington. We've had about, and I'm going to have to get you these exact numbers, but about an 8% increase in health care and about a 5 or 6% reduction as a state budget for educational funding. We've had a direct transfer of money out of schools into health care expenses. We have to reduce the rate of medical inflation in health care in this state for state employees, for teachers, and for Medicaid beneficiaries. I have a plan to do that. I've been working on this for years. I got into the health care plan provisions to allow us to try to reduce these costs, and I've got a way that we can in fact reduce medical inflation. And if I go through quickly, we need to do the things that we know can work. Give you some examples. King County has saved $61 million the last 2 years by adopting preventative health care measures, by having their employees have to have some skin in the game and some ability to stay a little fit and go see your doctor once a year, keep your hypertension under control. As a result, they've saved $61 million. If we could achieve the same level of savings, that's several $100 million for the state of Washington. Now, I can't guarantee that's a linear extrapolation, but it shows you the scope of what's
among
available.
state employees, does that mean?
I'm sorry?
Among state employees?
Yes. If we had the same rate of cost savings as King County has achieved, it translates to several $100 million among state employees, teachers, Medicaid population. Wenatchee Clinic has reduced their net cost 18%, almost a fifth, amongst highly intensive users of their medical care system by embracing preventative health care, an emphasis on primary care rather than acute specialist care, and accountable care organizations. So you don't have fee for service, you pay for quality rather than quantity. So there are enormous savings that we have to achieve and we can achieve in healthcare. We cannot have a fiscal situation in the state of Washington where one part of our budget has an inflation rate over twice the growth rate of the economy of the state of Washington. It'll eat us alive. And I believe I'm the best equipped to deal with this because frankly it's in my wheelhouse. I've been working on it for years. I actually formed a coalition in the House of Representatives called the Quality Care Coalition, and we were the ones that fought for and got some of the tools in the toolbox that can actually help us do this. And I'm the only candidate who's committed to doing this, incredibly. I'm the only candidate that really wants to move forward on this kind of health care.
Does the state employee, do their health plans have to change to implement what you're talking about? Like the actual insurance or even the rate that they're paying for that insurance?
Well, what needs to change is how we fashion, how we pay for these policies. Mm-hmm. We're going to need to reach some agreements with state employees in this regard so that they can become more participant in their own health. And there are some incentive programs that we can provide, like King County has done, and they've reached a good agreement with their labor force in order to do that. So there is some change involved. It can't happen just by executive fiat, but we need a governor who understands what needs to be done in that regard. Or there's no way to generate the money for schools that we need. And the reason I say this, there's a connection between healthcare reform and the educational budget that I think people really miss. The only way we can generate enough money for schools is to have a program of reducing our rate of healthcare inflation in the state of Washington when you look at the numbers. And the good news is we can do this because I've seen it happening around the state of Washington if we'll have a governor that's committed to it. The fourth thing I'll just mention quickly is I think we need to close some loopholes. We need to look at some loopholes that are no longer effective in the state of Washington. They need to be reviewed on a regular basis, and legislators should have to vote on them. And we haven't done that. And then there's some financing there for education as well.
You're a proponent of the Affordable Care Act, as you made it well known, and also the expansion of Medicaid in the state. What are your plans for funding the Medicaid when the government subsidy drops off in 3 years and you've got all these increased participants? The initial part is 80%, but that's going to go way down after 3 to 4 years.
So today, I believe there's good evidence this will actually save us dollars in the state of Washington. And there's a good report that came out yesterday that I will forward to you from the Urban Institute that has analyzed this. And here's their basic conclusion. Today, everybody in this room who has health insurance is paying a hidden tax that is on our shoulders of about $1,000. Everyone who has health insurance today in the state of Washington, our insurance company charges us about $1,000 per family per year for what I call the hidden tax of uncompensated care. And that means this: when a person who does not have insurance in Kitsap County gets a heart attack, they go to Harrison, they walk in, or they're wheeled into the ER, they spend a week or two there, they run up a bill of $200,000 to $300,000. The hospital does not get paid, and what do? Harrison's got to get the money somewhere, so they charge our insurance company. That insurance company charges us, or our employer, who's ever paying for our premium. That amounts to about $1,000 per person, per family per year. Now, if we do not embrace healthcare reform in this state, we will continue to have that obligation on our shoulders. For all 300,000 plus people, depending on how you count, 250 or plus 300,000, will be on our shoulders. Now, we have been given an opportunity to take that load off of our shoulders by embracing this, and for the first 3 years, having 100% of that taken off of our shoulders, and 90% of it taken off our shoulders thereafter. Now, there is absolutely no reason that I can think of not to at least do this for the first 3 years, because it's 100% financing, okay, 100%. Now it goes down to 90% thereafter. So instead of $1,000 on my shoulder, now I've only got $100 on my shoulder. That's still a heck of a good deal for us. And it's important to note this, and this is a common misconception. If we don't do this, we don't get to take a credit on our income tax on April 15th, right? If we decide not to do this, we don't get to say, oh, Uncle Sam, give me a 5% discount on income taxes. It doesn't work that way. This money is going to be paid one way or another. It's just going to go to Florida and California instead of us. And this is a big deal economically for us. We're going to have rural hospitals closing right and left around the state if we don't do this. There's just no question about this. The hospitals, if we don't do this, are in deep, deep trouble. Now, you will hear my opponent argue, well, but we have a thing called the welcome mat. But the number is right about 74,000 people that we think are going to come in to Medicaid now that are not, they're eligible for Medicaid. But what he doesn't understand is, which is really clear, those people are coming one way or another. They're not coming they're going to come because we're doing the exchanges, and the whole gestalt of this reform movement is going to bring them. So those people are coming whether we expand Medicaid or not. There's not an additional cost associated with what's called the welcome mat, and that's pretty clear from the analysis that's been done from the urban industry and others. He will also tell you that he doesn't want a world where 1 out of 3 people are Medicaid eligible, but the fact is the Institute has studied this, and they think about 1 out of 5 people, when this is done, will be available for Medicaid. And by the way, this is just not health care, this is senior citizens getting home care too. The senior citizens here getting more than just medical care. So I think it is a good fiscal decision for us, and it is a good economic decision for us to have healthier people in our state, and it is a less expensive way to pay for these folks' health care. And that's the thing that's maybe kind of hard to understand. It is a lot cheaper to provide primary care for a person who has diabetes than to have them not get the primary care and show up in the ER at Harrison with a cardiac event or a stroke or an amputation of their limb. It's just a lot cheaper. We're paying for these people today, but we're paying for them in the least efficient, most expensive way, and the way that's worse for their health. So I think this is a pretty clear choice.
I'm going to go back to education since we kind of just wandered over to the Medicaid. But real quickly, would you support funding, having a separate budget dedicated to education?
Well, we kind of do now, or should, in a sense.
Excuse me. So it's funded first. I guess I should have said it that way. A separate budget that's funded first.
Sure. I mean, you can say you build a budget if you want to build it around the paramount duty of the state. You know, that makes sense. I'm not sure it changes a lot. It's a statement of intent. One way or another, you need to get the money. Okay, so it's a statement of intent
that you agree with.
Yes, clearly, it's paramount duty of the state.
Okay.
And as I've said, I've been engaged in this for a long time.
Another thing in your plan, you're talking about reviews and things like that, and continuing improvement for principals, teachers, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pilot project that's going on across the state, and we have one of the districts that's involved. What's your opinion of that setup, how it's working now? Is that the sort of thing that you think would work with what you're proposing?
So we have to have a much more rigorous evaluation system. It needs to be based on evidence and needs to be more rigorous. And we have these pilot programs that are heading in that direction. So we have the beginning of an evaluation system. But it's going to take a lot of leadership from the governor's office to make sure that doesn't get derailed, to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten, to make sure that it gets implemented statewide. And it's going to take somebody, I was going to use the whip hand, but that's the wrong metaphor, to make sure that we continue to finish this job. We can't backslide on this evaluation system. It's extremely important. And the reason I believe this is important is my dad was a teacher at South and Garfield. And one of the joys of campaigning is you go around the state and you meet these 70-year-old people and say, hey, here's your dad, Frank Inslee. I go, yeah, why? And they said, well, he made a really big difference in my life. He made a difference. I'm a doctor now because of that. I know what excellent teaching can do, and I want to help make sure every kid has that. Now, the second thing we need to do on this is that, and I feel strongly about this, is that when we have the evaluation system, it has to be a significant part of the personnel decisions, hiring, riffing, and placement decisions. It can't just be based on seniority.
What about pay?
Pay, I believe that let me finish this issue if I can though, because this is an important issue, because right now, today, it doesn't have to be a significant part of the personnel decision. It has to become a significant part of the personnel decision. Now, the teacher's not on board this yet, but ultimately we're going to need to be on board in that regard. I think this is an important point. So pay, I believe that we need to create a mentoring corps of master teachers who are the most proficient teachers who will agree to take on mentoring responsibilities for other teachers and compensate them for that mentoring responsibility. This is important for several reasons. One, right now we're losing about 1 out of 2 teachers. They wash out in the first 5 years, and I think it's part because they don't get mentoring about how to really run a classroom. We sort of throw them into the pool. And I know from my dad's experience, he was a great teacher because he had a great mentor, Swede Lindquist. Taught him how to teach. We need to have every teacher have that in-classroom experience and then pay those master teachers additional compensation. We also have to have better, more dynamic principals. And that's why I'm proposing a residency program that to become a principal, you go through a 1-year residency at the foot of a really master principal. And the reason I feel strongly about this is when I go around the state, if you look at the schools that have been successful, it's because they've really had a dynamic, strong leader in the room, in the building as a principal. That's where there's really been gains. And we got to give principals some more authority in hiring as well.
Are you in favor of the charter school amendment that we're going to vote on next month?
I'm not. I'm concerned that it siphons money off these schools that already, are hemorrhaging dollars. You wrote an article yesterday in your paper, the day before yesterday, about this subject. That, the fact is that when a student leaves to go to charter school, there are several $1,000s go with them, and there's no way to replace that.
If we don't use charter schools, where do you find innovation within the system?
So I really believe in innovation. So what I would propose is, instead of having innovation just for 40 schools, that we embrace a model that has it for all 2,389. And so what I have proposed is to have an Innovation Schools grant program to provide some funds to schools that do want to try innovation in their schools. And we're seeing this in a lot of places. We've got the STEM Academy here. We've got Lincoln Center in Tacoma. We got Delta in Tri-Cities. We got Aviation in Seattle. We got a new STEM elementary school in West Seattle. I want to give schools and communities that want to try these new innovative approaches some dollars up front. It's not going to be huge, but it's going to help them for some planning and development models to help them move forward. We've got the seeds of really good innovation today in our public schools. We need to spread them, and I have a proposal to do that. If the charter schools initiative passes, I'll work to make sure that it works. One way or another, we need innovation, and I believe in it.
Any questions?
Congressman, I'm in the energy business. I work for military fuels, and the military basically tried to develop some alternative fuels at quite expensive proposition. There's some congressmen from Virginia and others that have opposed some of this alternative energy initiatives. I just want to get your feel for where do we go to develop the types of volumes that we need in alternative energy. You know, you can always prototype these small things, but scaling them to the size that we need for our economy. How do you do that?
Well, the first thing I would say is I kind of harken back to a Ben Franklin quote that I think fits this kind of issue. Franklin saw the first hot air balloon in Paris, and somebody said, well, what could be the possible purposes of this contraption? And he said, well, what are the possible purposes of a baby? And I think it's true about this whole host of energy sources. Right now we've got a biofuels component. We have the Green Fleet that ran their first exercise in Hawaii.
I furnished the fuel for that.
Good job. We're flying F-18s on biofuels designed partly here in the state of Washington. I was at the White House when Ray Mabus came up, and he was just thrilled. He says, Jay, we just broke the sound barrier in biofuels at the
Green Hornet.
The Green Hornet, you know, and he's really been showing leadership on this. But this is hugely expensive right now, right? Biofuels, as you know, are still many times expensive with kerosene and the like. But what we're finding is that a lot of these energy sources are coming down at a fairly rapid rate of decreased cost. And both because of scales, of volume, and because of technological advantage. Solar panels, for instance, the cost of installed solar has come down at least 100% in the last few years in the United States. It's an incredible reduction in costs. Biofuels will probably be a slower reduction because it's more based on volume, as you know. I think there's some opportunities with camelina. I think there's some opportunities with algae ultimately. We have the first sort of test facilities going on in New Mexico. In fact, one of the entrepreneurs, this guy who lives in Kitsap County, actually, he has a company called Sapphire. Do you know them by chance?
I do.
So these are early stages of development. And I am very encouraged that the Department of Defense has shown real leadership on this. They're probably as effective as the Department of Energy right now of actually trying to develop these, to scale some of these sources. What do you think? What do you think I should think about it?
I think it's going to be very difficult to get the volumes that you need. The jet fuel we produced came off the camelina seed. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the statistics, you got a plant like the state of Montana, California, Wyoming, mm-hmm. this huge area to get the volumes that you need.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You've got to come up with a different technology,
right.
and less petroleum consumption somehow. Right. Because you never produce the volumes.
Yeah. So do you think algae has a future in this regard? What do you think?
Well, we got some algae-based fuel out of Texas. And, I don't think so. Mm-hmm. But again, it's a volume thing. You have to have these huge ponds, and mm-hmm. The technology's not there yet. If they could grow more, maybe. Yeah,
I think that's a fair statement that the technology is not there yet. And the question is, you know, is there a reasonable opportunity to think that it will be? I think that there is, and we've got to continue on this path. It's more difficult to get an electric drive jet than a biofuel one. And we do have to figure out a way to reduce carbon emissions somehow. Aviation's about 1 to 2% of CO2 emissions worldwide. It's not insignificant. So my view is we ought to continue trying to, in the R&D phase in this.
We're getting kind of close to the end, but I wanted to let, do you have a question?
Go ahead.
We'll try to get 2 more quick ones in here.
If the marijuana initiative, as it's written now, passes, what's going to be your position as governor if the state gets into a food fight with the federal government over interpretation of the law?
Well, I intend to defend Washington State's decision, and if the initiative, I'm not voting for it, but if it passes, I intend to be a vigorous advocate for the position that our state has made, and I would do everything reasonable to try to get the administration to allow us to be masters of our own destiny in this state. It is a similar thing I've been doing in medical marijuana to try to get the administration to be reasonable in this regard. I've actually, and I co-sponsored a bill to reclassify marijuana so that we'd have a better leverage with the federal government. We weren't successful in that. So I would try to help the will of Washington to be affected, and I would do nothing to try to negate that initiative. Whether or not it does pass, I do intend to continue my efforts to try to free us to use medical marijuana pursuant to the state's decision. And I also believe that we should recognize there are higher priorities for law enforcement than the investigation and prosecution right now of personal use of marijuana. I think we need to reorient some of those law enforcement resources to more serious crimes, whether or not the initiative passes. So I hope that that's the direction we're going.
Okay, my area that I'm very interested and concerned about kind of fits into the DEL, Department of Early Learning, Race to the Top and all that under Christine Gregoire. But, and I know from what I've read and heard you say that you're very interested in promoting early childhood education. And I guess if I could ask you, what is one thing in 4 years as governor you would want to accomplish in the field of early education? And I'm talking about birth to 5, not just 3 to 5, but birth to 5. What would you want said, okay, this governor did this for early childhood?
So maybe I'll cheat and say 2 things. First, all-day kindergarten. Second, a recognition that 100% of the students who have been, that all students, or all children have been assessed, and those that are in need, in fact, get 100% coverage for their early learning needs. And we're not there yet. I think that would be a great achievement for our state. And the payoffs in reduced law enforcement costs, decreased unemployment, increased economic activity would be prodigious.
Do you think that could be done in 4 years?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. And the reason is I think this is something that, you know, we're developing a bipartisan consensus on this, in part because the neuroscience is so powerful. For every $1 investment we make, you can save up to $17. There's a variety of estimates, but some have put it as high as $17 of decreased social costs associated with it.
It's cheaper to educate a little baby than to take care of a prisoner in prison.
And when you work on the dropout rate issue, right, so we're losing over 1 out of 5 kids in dropouts. The best thing you can do probably to prevent dropouts is early childhood education. A lot easier to do it there than it is when they're 15, 16. So
how does that rank on your to-do list?
It's probably, you hate to pick your favorite child, but I would say it's the highest because it's the most productive. You get the biggest bang for the taxpayer's buck from it. But that's kind of hard too, while we've just cut our college, you know, budget by 40%, and we're turning away 600 engineering students at the University of Washington. So it's hard to pick what's the absolute favorite. If I had to say what's the biggest bang for the taxpayer's buck, I would say that dollar would be most effective.
Well, thanks. We're about at the time that we promised for this.
Thank you. I hope that we generate some interest, and I hope you all vote.
Yeah.